now it's time for Willem's keynote presentation on the Great Reset and what is happening in the world.
Reset,
the big reset? You said Great Reset earlier.
No. Oh, yeah? Oh, well. Yeah, sorry for this picture. Casper, he thought it was a good picture, but this one is 15 years old, so I'm not aging well in a bear market. So I've got very limited time, but I promised you to give an update on the big reset. And when I traveled to China for the presentation of the Chinese edition of the big reset, it's Klaus Schwab who turned it in the Great Reset 2 years ago. I asked a Chinese professor, the book was published by Chinese Renmin University, and I don't have an academic background, and the Chinese are not publishing this book because they think I'm a wonderful guy. It turned out that this book and my analysis about the Western fiat, the dollar system, came quite close to China's view of the dollar system. So I was intrigued that, like I said, I've been cancelled here by the media because I have an alternative view. But in China, it's the mainstream view. And when I asked this professor to give me a title for the presentation at the International Monetary Institute in Beijing, he said, after waiting for 44 years, and I first didn't understand what he meant, but this was 2015. So when I took 44 years off, then it was 1971, and that was when President Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard. And that made a few things clear to me. So the Chinese really understand, this was during a speech at the Chinese university, the Chinese really understand that, they really understood very well that the current dollar system is in its final phase, and they have been preparing for quite some time and waiting for the next phase for the international monetary system. The subtitle of the Big Reset is The War on Gold and the Financial Endgame. While I was working for RTL Television, I did a lot of research, wrote my first book, Als de Dollar Valt, and always wrote, well, some articles explaining that gold would be the best hedge because this system of constant debasement of currency would lead to a revival of gold, and gold being the ultimate form of money. It was quite clear to me that there were forces at work coming from the US keeping gold down because the dollar is not gold-linked, not gold-backed anymore, so gold became the enemy for the current dollar system. And I wrote this, 21 years ago, that JP Morgan was the big enemy because there was enough analysis done by many other experts that they were shorting the market. And this was in 2001. And I was quite convinced that gold just bottomed out because it declined for 20 years between 1980 and 2000. So I started to invest myself in gold and silver, started to look into the gold and mining shares. I wanted to hedge my own net worth. I had some real estate investments in the Netherlands. And I was advising people to buy gold as a hedge from that moment on. And I recently found the first manuscript for my first book, Als de Dollar Valt. And it has been a constant theme in my work to warn about this debasement of the currencies. I was warning about a pending huge crisis in the US in the housing market. And over time, people got so fed up with me that when you were following the mainstream media here, investors in gold, they were called goudgekkies, you know, the crazy gold guys. And there was no serious debate about gold possible, and that always struck me. So we are so used to this paper dollar system that hedging yourself and fleeing towards gold seems crazy. But now we know the manipulation story, the gold manipulation story has been proven. We only had to wait 20 years to see these headlines in which JP Morgan, they had to pay a fine of almost 1 billion. This is a statement of the Department of Justice that JP Morgan's metal desk was a criminal enterprise. So that's quite shocking. But still, you know, in the Western world, who of you has ever been tipped by his bank to buy physical gold? It's still a taboo in the Western world. It's different in China. So when I wrote The Big Reset in 2013, I wrote that a system reset is imminent. World's financial system will need to find a new anchor around 2020. I think we reached the point that huge changes are fast approaching. And when I revised The Big Reset in 2016, I added a chapter on Russia and China joining forces to try to reconstruct the current world order together. This was a statement coming from Moscow in, what was it, 2015. Now, 8 years later, we all seem to be shocked that Russia and China are joining forces to fight the West. And especially after the military invasion in Ukraine started, it became quite clear that our Western reaction of implying sanctions on Russia hasn't been followed by many countries worldwide. Actually, we've seen a strong divide between the West, US and its allies, and the BRICS countries and its allies. And on a recent visit of President Xi and Putin, President Xi was called on camera to promise Putin that they would work together, join forces, to bring changes not seen in 100 years. So things are moving fast now. One of the analysts who is on top of this story and very early on understood what the significance of all this was, that's Zoltan Pozsar. He's a credit analyst for Credit Suisse. He used to work at the Federal Reserve, and only a few weeks after the invasion in Ukraine, he published this report. We are witnessing the birth of Bretton Woods III, a new world monetary order centered around commodity-based currencies in the East that will likely weaken, well, the West. A crisis is unfolding, a crisis of commodities. Commodities are collateral, and collateral is money. And he explains how we're reaching the end of a paper dollar system based on paper assets. And he is pointing towards the resurgence of commodities and gold being the real money. And this, I wanted to point this out because why did I start a commodity discovery fund? We were always looking for a hedge because we were in this era, this century of constant debasement of the currencies. Now inflation has arrived, it's becoming quite obvious. It also explains the strong growth of our fund. And now we've reached the point that it's not only Zoltan Pozsar, but even the ING Bank published a report that the BRICS might introduce their own reserve currency, their own world reserve currency. And there's some rumors that it might be gold-linked or gold-backed. And the reason we started this fund to invest as much fiat money as possible into commodities, especially the precious metals, should be a great choice when the changes are arriving as described by Zoltan Pozsar and ING. And if you follow our media in the West, you're probably not aware that over 140 countries worldwide are not joining us in sanctions against Russia. Doesn't mean they're all friends of Putin. It means these 140 countries, all the countries in Latin America, all countries in Africa and the Middle East, and most in Asia, they have China now as their main trading partner. And that's a big change from good 20 years ago, when they had the US as its main trading partners. And what do you do when your main trading partner is not the US anymore, but China? You look at China for money. You don't look at the IMF or the World Bank. So China is supplying a lot of financial support for all these countries, trying to bring them into the BRICS alliance. So when you follow our Western media, you get this, you have this idea that we all support the sanctions, but the world is changing rapidly. And here you can see the investments by China in all these parts of all these continents. And I think these changes are going full speed ahead now. The BRICS will have their new conference in Johannesburg in August this year. I plan to go there. I expect some important news coming from this BRICS conference. And as Zoltan Poza pointed out, this is the start of Bretton Woods 3.0. Bretton Woods 1.0 was in 1944 when the US sold us their dollar system. They had to promise the dollar was as good as gold. And as explained, the US took the dollar off the gold standard because they lost half of their gold in the late 1960s, when many European countries didn't trust the US monetary policy and exchanged surplus dollars for physical gold. Ever since, the US hasn't sold an ounce of gold, but the US convinced many of their friends in the West to sell most of their gold holdings. Now we see a fast expanding BRICS alliance. Even Saudi Arabia, which has been the key supporter of the dollar since the petrodollar deal in 1974, has, openly said that they're willing to do deals now in other currencies than the dollar. They might even join the BRICS alliance later this year. We heard the same from the president of Mexico. We even heard President Macron from France and the German Bundeskanzler make statements in China that France and Germany support a multipolar world. And this is code language for saying we don't want to have this dollar system anymore as the sole world reserve currency. The Turkish interior minister last week even stated the whole world hates America. So suddenly all these countries, they feel empowered enough to stand up against the US, stand up against the West. And I think the repercussions will be great. And actually, in my opinion, it's all unfolding now. The scenario of the big reset, the war on gold and the financial endgame. The war on gold, keeping gold low, like the central bankers have done in the 1960s with the London gold pool. That failed at the end of the 1960s. Then we saw a rapid rise of gold from $35 to over $800 over a period of 10 years. We could expect something like that to happen. If you study the physical market for gold, the physical demand for gold by sovereign countries last year was the largest since 1968. And that shows that sovereign countries, central bankers, are hedging themselves by buying as much gold as possible. So the revaluation of gold, which is a recurring theme as well in my books, could well be expected in the next few years. This is a statement that was from the press conference when the German leader visited Beijing. So we all know that the current explosion of debt, especially in the US, This is unsustainable. It took the US 215 years to reach a debt level of 7 trillion. Since March 2020, 7 trillion was added. So we're fast approaching an important point in which the system will see changes coming from the East. And even the media in the US can't ignore it anymore, and they keep publishing reports like that. And if you look at this graph, it's about, I copied this from Bloomberg, it's about the changes of the financial reserves of central banks. So the dollar reserves are going down quite a bit, and this is a very early sign that there's a move away from the dollar. I don't think this will mean the dollar will crash and become worthless. We used to have the British Empire. The British Empire turned into an American empire. The British pound is still around, became less valuable. The same might happen to the dollar. And this quote by Larry Summers it proves what's happening outside the Western world today. China is giving so much financial support to all these countries, and the US is just giving them a lecture. There's one big risk. At the end of the big reset, I wrote, I hope we can work together with the East, the West and the East, to move this system into another phase for the world's financial system. But there's a risk we can have a confrontation, we could even have a war. And now the US clearly sees China as a major enemy. And we see many statements coming from the US that they're prepared to go to war because the decline of the current status for the dollar is there's a lot at stake for the US. So let's hope this warmongering from the Western countries is not followed up by China. But China has become more militant as well. China was always very diplomatic in their statements regarding the West. But we see that changing, and a more militant tone comes from Beijing. And Larry Summers has warned that it's very risky for the US to try to tear China down as well. So the next few years, the next few months, next few years will be, will become very special. We should expect some huge moves, especially in the currencies, and China being one of them. This tweet recently came from the official spokesman from China, and it's the first time I've been following China for quite some time in their communication, especially and their reaction on the US. They openly point to the fact that the US attempted assassination of 50+ foreign leaders, and the Chinese have done their homework. People who read my latest book, Patronen van Bedrog, which was only published in Dutch, Patterns of Deception, will recognize that a lot of this information was also published in Patronen van Bedrog. China is able to confront the US now, because we used to have the situation that the US was the largest customer for China, so they couldn't afford to lose it. But if you look at the Chinese economy, US imports from China, it's now a good 2% of the Chinese economy. So we have this showdown in the world of geopolitics. And I would like to end by this quote also from Zoltan Pozsar. Investors are not particularly well trained to deal with geopolitical risk, because for generations, geopolitics didn't matter. Anyone who traded securities or ran a portfolio since the end of the Second World War did so in the cocoon of a unipolar world order. And this is changing now, and I think that's the reason why you need to have good hedges in your portfolio. And you know our golden rule, 25% in real estate, 25% in physical gold and silver, 25% in stocks, equities, could be our fund, 25% in cash/Bitcoin, and that's the way we'll survive this crisis. Thank you.
Well, phenomenal.
Not a positive note, but well, for precious metals
Well,
it
the
is.
world's always changing anyway, right? Might as well play along. Might as well play along. We have time for a few questions, Willem. Do we have any questions for Willem from the audience? I'm sure we do. Oh, there's somebody right there. Just wait till the microphone gets to you, please.
Are we time-wise?
7 minutes ahead of schedule.
Yeah, we should stop.
Thank you. Willem, you just talked about your golden rules, or the wets van Willem. You talked about 25% in real estate. What do you think about investing in real estate in Holland or the Netherlands right now, or for the future?
Yeah, well, personally, when people think about investing in real estate, most investors make a little mistake to think they always should invest in their home market. And the real estate market in the Netherlands is totally different from, let's say, the real estate market in Dubai. Personally, I bought some apartments in Dubai. Why? Prices of real estate in Dubai went down for 15 years. It's like gold in around 2000. If you look at real estate in the Netherlands, has been going up for, 50 years? So when I decide from my own portfolio where to invest my money, I prefer to buy real estate, which is real cheap now compared to, well, real estate in Amsterdam. In Dubai, I pay 4,000 euro the square meter for the best location. In Amsterdam, I pay 12,000 a meter for an old building in the Pipe, which is... and so I still believe in real estate because, like Zoltan Poza mentioned, you know, we move away from paper assets to hard assets, and real estate, these are great real hard assets.
You have a follow-up question, or?
Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Do we have any other questions for Willem? There's one.
Yeah.
Yes. Hi, Willem. Now that the US and Europe central bankers are actually on your side and are net buyers, how does that change your perspective on this situation?
Well, there's a distinction. You see all central banks east of Germany adding to their gold reserves, and quite a bit, even Poland and Hungary. And these countries are buying tons of gold. But the countries in Europe here are still allies of the US. And I'm quite sure that a lot of pressure has been used from the US to convince them not to start buying physical gold. Ireland is an exception. Ireland started to buy gold. But what we've seen in the European countries, they stopped selling the last 10 to 15 years. They started to repatriate gold from New York, from the Federal Reserve vaults in New York. But we always think that it's about the West. It's not about the West anymore. The countries who apply sanctions on Russia now, only 1.5 billion people live in those countries. There are over 6 billion people living in these 140 countries who don't support the sanctions. It's a numbers game. We're being outnumbered. The BRICS, the total size of the BRICS economy is already larger than the G7 economy. So it's not about us. The changes will be coming from the East, like Zoltan Poza predicted.
Absolutely. Do we have any more questions for Willem? There's one all the way in the back. Raise your hand again.
Kids
There.
as well. Kids as well.
No? Okay, didn't see that one. Yep. We'll...
Thanks, Willem. Do you think there will be any change in the relative premium that we pay for exploration and mining assets in, for example, North America versus countries that are more likely to trade with the future BRICS countries. We know there's a premium difference now between, for example, Canadian assets and South American assets, which is an investment opportunity. Will there be something like that?
Well, we could see a situation where countries who are part of the BRICS alliance are regarded as less risky than countries like Canada, because Canada sold out of their gold holdings on advice of their US friends. And Canada might be tempted to nationalize gold mines one day. While the BRICS countries really want to develop this gold industry and want to push the price higher. But there have been some rumors that it's also worked out in the big reset. The US might try to take the initiative again and revalue gold, because the US has 8,000 tons of gold. It's on the balance sheet for the historical cost price of $42. So if the US takes the initiative and revalues gold to $4,000, they could even link the dollar to gold again. That would take a lot of power away from the BRICS alliance to be able to do this, the same. And I heard some credible rumors from some good sources that this was openly discussed in the US in March 2020, when the whole system was coming down during the Corona crash. So there's lots happening behind the scenes. Don't expect the media, it is not to blame the media, but don't expect this can be or will be discussed, because the media doesn't know. The media can only report facts, and these are all scenarios and rumors. So, well, keep following us. Yeah.
Maybe time for 2 more questions, I think. Kit?
Willem, there's a lot of discussion, rumors of the shortage of physical gold. As we know that vast majority of pricing and trading as gold is paper gold on the futures exchange. There are some examples. One I can think of, the Kensington mine in Alaska. They don't ship gold bullion, they ship a gold concentrate. That goes to a smelter in Asia and is never really seen again or reported as gold, because when it leaves, it's a concentrate. So what do you think will be the result of, is there a shortage of physical gold, and what will happen when that maybe gets recognized?
Gold demand, physical gold demand is that high that needs to be stressed within the gold system, and the strong rise of the gold price tells you a story. But you also know that central banks, they own a lot of gold. They can always use that gold to, to disturb the markets. It has been done in the 1960s with the London gold pool. But there's a rumor now as well that the Central Bank of France, the Banque of France, that they're buying 3 to 4 tons of gold per day now. So when news like that would break, it's like Saudi pivoting from the west to the east and declaring an end to the petrodollar system. So when you want to know what can happen to the price of gold, and I expect a problem in silver first, because that's a much smaller market, and central banks don't own any silver, so they can't use these tricks. Maybe they can use the ETF reserves, but when you look at the silver market, that's a very small market. Silver is outperforming gold now, and if you want to know how fast this how fast these prices can rise when there's a change in the fundamental market, look at palladium. What happened to palladium? There was a surge in demand for palladium in 2017. The paper shorts got scared. They were pushed out of the market, and palladium went up 4x within 2 years. And if you study the outstanding future contracts, palladium is still low. Silver is very high, platinum is very high, gold is very high. So I think the usual suspects are still able to control the precious metal prices, besides palladium. But they could well lose control. And when we have these big changes coming and the BRICS becoming more powerful, and we know the BRICS like the precious metals, you have to expect that the managing of the precious metals prices, it will break. And then we could have some very serious moonshots.
Moonshots, I'll take it. $4,000 gold sounds interesting. Fantastic.
3,000 is enough.
I'll take it. I'll take it. We had one last question I saw. We wanted, was that gentleman over there? That's the last one, and then we'll break. And,
Yeah, short break.
Het huidige paradigma in de economie lijkt te zijn het modern monetary theory. En dat lijkt een beetje op, als je geld nodig hebt voor goede dingen, dan moet je het gewoon bijdrukken. En als je dat gaat lenen, kun je het altijd terugbetalen. Want dan druk je gewoon weer nieuw geld bij om ook de rente te betalen. Hoe houdbaar is dit? En is dit nog altijd het paradigma zoals dat in Amerika en in de westerse wereld opgang doet?
Yeah, the question is how sustainable is this idea about modern monetary theory, where you can always print money and always, buy time and solve problems. I think we've done that for the last 50 years, after taking the dollar off the gold standards. We always could use the central bank balance sheets and just print more money. But now inflation is back, and we have the superinflation. You know, food inflation in many countries is 20–25%. I think it shows that there's a price to be paid if you continue with the debasement of currencies. And I think we reached the point that it doesn't work any longer. So I once said in an interview, you know, we reached the end of cheap food, cheap energy, cheap labor, but we also reached the end of cheap solutions, which is just printing money. Because there's one problem you can't solve by printing money, and that's inflation. You can't solve inflation by printing money, you know. So central bankers are really cornered. The central bankers tell this themselves. Lex Hoogduin, Dutch former central banker, he said. So the central banks now have to choose killing inflation or killing the economy. And that's the reason also why we get a bit more defensive in our fund. I get a bit more defensive personally, because, it could get messy. On that positive note.
And on that bombshell, fantastic. Willem, what a wonderful day. This is sort of the end of the official part of the Commodity Discovery Fund Day. Please stick around if you're a participant in the fund to participate in the annual meeting afterwards. It starts at 4:15. So we're going to have a quick 25-minute break, and then reconvene, or you will reconvene in here, because I'm done. I'm out.
Yeah, let's say 20 minutes. 4:10, we start the annual meeting. That will be in Dutch, actually.
That's rude.
We have another 40 slides.
Fantastic. Everybody else, thank you so much for coming.